Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 24th of December. Merry Christmas. And today we're going to be looking at the Donetsk and Luhansk fronts. And as you can see on my map, I changed the color of the polygons that show recent advances by the Russian side to this middle muted red color. In this way you can distinguish recent advances from older advances, and I'll do the same thing for the Ukrainians, of course, wherever they advance in the future. But we're going to begin by looking at Novomykhailivka, where over the past few days there's been some very significant Russian bombardment, especially in the southern part of the village, and that includes the southern outskirts, where you did have Ukrainian troops operating in some fields and in some trenches that they set up to the south of the village. And now we're seeing a lot of that occurring in the houses and in the trenches built in between those houses within the center of the village itself. So there is some very significant Russian artillery preparation before their infantry assaults these positions. And what you're seeing is mechanized assault by the Russian forces, a lot of tanks, MTLBs, BMPs, and then you have Russian infantry dismounting along this road in particular. You see I'll mark it in red. Dismounting at a certain area where they established a foothold, including the cemetery, including these agricultural facilities. And that's basically their spearhead as they try to enter into additional parts and to put pressure on the flanks of the main Ukrainian garrison in the center of the village. And of course, there's been Ukrainian counterattacks on the local level that we discussed, like around this agricultural facility over here. And the Ukrainians, they do claim to have repelled 4 attacks over the past few days. And then they released this drone imagery along this road in particular, which has been geolocated, which shows around a dozen armored losses, which again, those have occurred over a pretty long period of time. So it's not necessarily recent, but it should give you an idea as to some of the factors that have led to the material damage. You know, the Ukrainians have laid a lot of mines, especially on some of these roads in the south, and that has caused some of the damages, of course. Also, some may be Ukrainian, but nonetheless, you also had a lot of Ukrainian ATGM crews from the 79th Air Assault Brigade that were operating on the outskirts of Novomykhailivka and still are, to try to put a pause onto the mechanized assaults, trying to disrupt their columns. You also have some drone units operating in the region associated with the 79th, and also the Shadow Drone Unit, this unit over here. And then you also have some artillery strikes that have been caught on camera, and I have a lot of them marked on my map. So yeah, there are a myriad of factors. Nonetheless, those mechanized assaults have paved the way for a Russian foothold, as we discussed previously. And so now you're seeing a lot of such bombardment and a lot of fire occurring in areas that are much closer to the center of the village. And even further north, we also have an increase in pressure with this geolocated video showing a Russian drone unit, Sudoplatov. Their FPV hits Ukrainian infantry, and again, this is like probably 1 soldier or 2 soldiers in this video, so it's very small quantities. So that gives you an idea of the fact that, first of all, this is the front line, and second of all, that it is not that well manned in comparison to, you know, the southern flank of Novomykhailivka, for example, where you do have significant resources for defenses. In this area, it hit the infantry located in this dugouts. And this is basically confirmation of where the current line of contact basically is on the northeast, where you did see the Russian forces increase pressure, and you can see some of the units on my map that haven't been involved in such attacks. There's still no confirmation about Zhverinet's fortification system being taken over by the Russians, but it does seem that the Ukrainians have coalesced whatever forces they do actually have in this region along these tree lines over here. So you actually do have a pretty solid line of Ukrainian defense, which has been holding despite some head-on assaults from the Russian side along this tree line over here. And so this is a bit of an extension of it just to the north. But what you'll notice is that the Russian pressure from the northern flank of Novomykhailivka, which, by the way, is very important, and I think we should be paying more attention to it, because a lot of the areas Russia is taking over are located on heights that overlook some of the villages like Novomykhailivka, Pobieda, and the roads that are connecting all of them in this region. So there is a local significance, but you see how they've increased the pressure from these regions upon the advances occurring in Maryinka. And so that's a perfect segue into what's going on in this town over here, because over the past 2-3 days, we've seen the Russian forces advance even more. And again, you could see on my map, these are some of the more recent advances that have occurred over the past month or so in this town. You could see more recently the Russian forces advance even deeper into Ivano-Franka streets. So they don't have 100% control over Maryinka just yet. There may actually be claims coming out from sources about the full capture tomorrow, so we're going to have to wait and see. But for now, the Russian forces are nearly at the municipal boundaries of the city. What happened was the Ukrainian forces did have an outpost along this road over here. I'll mark it in blue for you guys. But it appears that just due to the fact that it was at the line of contact, so again, it's very costly to hold on to those forward positions. A lot of those houses are just completely leveled. You have to be in basements. It's very hard to go to and from those positions. So it seems like at some point, the Ukrainian garrison over there was just pushed out, and they've now established their new line of contact along this road, which separates these two specific ponds. And so now you have Russian clearing operations in the northwesternmost part of Maryinka. And at the same time, you have the Russian forces expanding their zone of control in the fields directly to the west of Maryinka. So just in terms of the scale of those advances, you can see they advance through these fields over here. Mark it in red for you guys in that perimeter. And a bit further south, they've also advanced. And this is in an effort to, first of all, increase pressure to the northeast of Pobieda, but that's still in its infancy as there are still Russian operations ongoing in Maryinka. But at the same time, by advancing along this attack vector, they've nearly reached this road that connected Pobieda to Hyorivka. And more generally, this is a Russian advance from the east towards the Ukrainian defenses that are now coalescing around Hyorivka following the Russian advances within Maryinka. Now, moving on to the Bakhmut front, there is a lot to dissect over here that's occurred starting around December 20th. And you have, for instance, in the area, basically the southwesternmost corner of Bakhmut, where we've seen the Russians over the past 2 weeks attacking the Ukrainian fortified positions that have been holding really since the Battle of Bakhmut ended. And so now we have confirmation, again, based on mapping from Deep State and Petrenko, so these are Ukrainian sources, showing that the Ukrainians have lost control over these agricultural fields, and there's also a lot of rural dachas in the area, so the Ukrainians built up trenches in this region over an extended period of time. The Russian forces stormed those trenches with support from aerial drones, and so that's the current front line as a result, with the Ukrainians withdrawing to some of the tree lines that run along the road connecting Bakhmut to Ivanivske and along some of the tree lines directly to the east of Ivanivske. Now, as a result of this Russian advance, the Russians have control of this height, this local height over here that overlooks the valley on which Ivanivske is located, and at the same time, you have the Russian forces increasing pressure along the northeastern flank of Ivanivske, which is located on similar elevation to Ivanivske, so there's no advantage in terms of heights, but there is a road that leads directly from Bakhmut into Ivanivske from the northeast, and so you can see the vector of Russian attack pretty clearly. And there's also some Ukrainian defensive positions in tree lines located in that same area that the Russians are likely attacking at the moment. Not with the same ferocity that we're going to see from the Popivska area, but again, there is an increase in relative terms. Now, this is the area that's really interesting, as the Russian forces, we know they've been able to advance in this region really since the beginning of December, but the pace of the Russian advances around December 21st was pretty large in comparison, so we're going to go through and dissect all of that. First of all, you had some pretty significant Russian advances in the area around the T-0506 road. So just in terms of the extent of those gains, at the time when this was mapped by Deep State on December 22nd, the full extent of the Russian advance looked something like this, where the Russian forces had full control over the cemetery area. Cemetery, I'll mark it in red for you guys, is over here. Full control over the car racing track. Additional control over trenches that run along the heights of the T-0506 road, leading from Chasiv Yar into Bakhmut. And control of some of the lower lying fields, I'll mark in yellow over here, that are to the south of the heights. And so that was a Russian advance that was really capitalized upon. They basically capitalized upon their advances within the Popivska trenches that the Russian paratroopers had taken over, and were able to advance towards some of the Ukrainian positions that were holding out in some of these tree lines that are marked over here in yellow for you guys. And then a bit further to the north, the Russian forces also advanced along the rail line. Again, the rail line has been a very important Russian vector of attack since the beginning of their offensive activities over here. So the Russian forces were able to advance pretty large area in relative terms around here. I'll mark it within this red perimeter. So they were able to overrun the Ukrainian dugouts and trenches that were built up along the tree lines parallel to the rail line. And this was done again with the support of these drones that were dropping grenades onto the small Ukrainian infantry squads. And sometimes it was just lone Ukrainian soldiers that were manning the area. And so that's the process that was dealt with along this vector of attack, with the Ukrainians really falling back to this line over here that I'm marking blue for you guys. That's the current Ukrainian front line. And as a result of the Russian advances on the flanks, in addition to the Russian pressure due to a large quantity of firepower, drones, and artillery, the Russian forces were also able to enter into the northeastern outskirts of Bakhmut, and the Ukrainians were forced to withdraw from nearly half of the village itself. And again, this entire area is located on a rather low elevation, and now we're beginning to see the Russian forces enter some of the heights on the flanks, which is something that I've discussed ad nauseum by now. So, for instance, the Russians are approaching the heights from the south, which are located around here, so they are reaching the gray zone in that regard. And then further north, we actually saw a Russian advance on the northern flank, which is pretty interesting. We hadn't seen many advances on the northern flank for the Russians in a while, but due to FPV strikes and a Russian storming of Ukrainian defenses, they were able to overrun this specific tree line, where I've collected a lot of videos that have been geolocated from this specific area. So it seems like the Ukrainians did have a line of defense over there with a pretty significant amount of forces holding onto it. But now the Russian forces have taken it over, so that could be used as a forward operating base to launch further attacks from not really heights, as the heights are a bit further south, but from these fields and then further south into the valley of Bakhmut itself. And then looking at what Russia controls, it's areas south of this pond, a lot of residential areas, and that's the foothold in terms of actually getting into the village itself. Then looking a bit further north at the area to the southwest of Novomykhailivka, the Russian forces also advanced around here. They got control of some additional forested areas, and the areas that they advanced along are really interesting because it's basically forming an attack vector along this specific road that will lead into Hryhorivka. Hryhorivka is one of the other Ukrainian defensive nodes to the east of the Donbass Canal that's still holding. And so this is also a Russian target in the wider operation to secure positions east of the Donbass Canal, which, if you guys are not aware, is located over here, and to get control of the heights that are located on that canal before actually assaulting Chasiv Yar head on. So there is a rationale in securing the eastern flanks of the village of Hryhorivka. And so that's the explanation for those gains. But on the 23rd of December, the Ukrainians actually launched a localized counterattack, specifically in the area to the west of Kromove. And this is likely due to the fact they perceived the Russian advances as really threatening in terms of the pace, and that they could lead to a significant advance on the northern flank of Ivanivske. And so as a result, the Ukrainians pulled in some of the battalions that are operating in the region to launch this localized counterattack. If I had to guess, the 21st Sarmat Battalion of the 56th Motorized Brigade was one of the leading units, as one of the fighting forces that's acting as a vanguard for some of the other Ukrainian units that are digging in further west along these positions over here, along some of the heights around the Kalinina suburb, for instance, or around Ivanivske. And so you had this Ukrainian localized counterattack. In terms of the advance of the counterattack, it may be about a kilometer, a bit less than that, actually. And they were able to reestablish control over some of the forested areas, over some of the fields that are on rather low elevation. So the Russians do still control the heights located on the T-0506 road. And they were able to knock the Russians out of their positions in this local cemetery. So now it's a gray zone. And so that's the current situation on this front. And lastly, moving on to the Kremlin-Liman axis, there was an advance reported on the 22nd of December by deep states. Again, they're really keeping track of these advances. So the perimeter of the advance is around here. The previous Russian line, as you can see, was really centered around several large forested areas, which did still maintain a lot of their foliage, as could be seen in the Ukrainian drone footage released when they were targeting the Russian infantry, which actually were advancing in rather large squads compared to other parts of the front line, probably because the intensity of the fighting over here is generally lower, and so the Russians were more comfortable with sending larger squads towards the line of contact. Nonetheless, we got an idea of where the Russians were advancing. And now it seems like they've advanced even further in terms of the extent of their gains. We could say they advanced about 2.5 nearly kilometers westwards, and were able to establish positions. And again, a lot of these other tree lines, there's probably trenches that were built up by the Ukrainians in some of these areas that are now being taken over by the Russian side. And in terms of the Ukrainian defenders, in this region, you do have some drone groups like Tactical Group Atom, which previously fought around in Bakhmut. You have some local rifle battalions. You have actually the 97th Battalion of the 60th Mechanized Brigade. This is the main fighting force leading the defense to the east of Terny. And again, based on the vector of attack, the Russian forces are pushing towards Terny. The Russians are now 3.7 kilometers away from Terny itself when you measure it. And Terny acts as the staging point for the Ukrainian soldiers once they cross over the Zherebets River. And again, when you look at the Russian advance, it seems like they are trying to put pressure onto the Ukrainian positions along the Zherebets bridgehead, which has been a Russian objective to eliminate this bridgehead in order to, first of all, reduce pressure onto Crimea, but also to then develop their own attacks further westwards to retake Liman in the long term. And so now we do have a minor step in that, but again, due to the priority for the Russian forces, but also for the Ukrainian defenders being on other parts of the front line, the really volume and the frequency of these advances is lower in relation to those other parts of the front line. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.